So thank you very much, Michael, for the invitation to kind of speak to you about some sort of offshoots of my main research, which, as Michael just mentioned, is on early Benjamin ideas of mathematics, and in particular, insofar as mathematics was and continues to be the paradigm for a certain objectivity in the reason state, and an objectivity insofar as it defines what is possibly experienceable under the idea, under the precondition that we are all rational and similarly sentient, similarly embodied people, entities, or beings. The talk I want to give today is an offshoot of my core research on Benjamin because it focuses on Agamben. It's going to focus on Agamben insofar as I'm going to use Agamben as a departure point for investigating precisely those limits to what is relegated as possible experience, and therefore for the basis of something like a community, a state, legal constitution, and all of those things will come into what I'm going to talk about today under the title of the poverty in art. Now, I'm not going to tackle the issue of poverty per se or art per se. I'm certainly not going to talk about the poverty in the practice of art, as in all artists are not paid very well. I'm going to be talking more on a limited notion of what is the impoverishment in art might look like, and in particular, a certain understanding of art. And I get to this because primarily I am coming at the field of visual arts as a very textual person. I am trained in comparative literature and philosophy, and I am looking at the art object also from the point of view of its limits for those of us who are constrained by the word. And I think Agamben, in the piece that I distributed for the occasion of this lecture, draws a lot on this issue, the limit between the word and the art object, whatever that object may be, in defining what he means to be some sort of force that art could be. Now, so the lecture, as I said, takes this point of departure, takes as its point of departure the three interrelated yet very different artifacts. The first is a sculpture by Twombly entitled Untitled in 1984. This is the one that whose image I'm projected here. The second is a short reflection by the philosopher Agamben on what he takes to be the essential character of this sculpture. And finally, a poem, the 10th Duino Elegy by the early 20th century German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, to which Agamben refers, and from which Twombly's sculpture takes the final lines as an inscription. Now, what drew me originally to these artifacts was the intuition that they seem to contain in Nietzsche an idea that, according to a certain line of thinking in political theory, operates at the very center of the governability of our natural lives, and therefore, arguably, makes it possible for our natural lives to be governed and administered and rendered productive for ends that are possibly other than our own. This idea is what Agamben, in his short piece on Twombly, calls the topical moment, at which the artwork appears to make happen something other than the instantiation of the will of the artist, and in so doing, attains to an ontological force of its own. To quote from Agamben, "There comes a point on the creative journey of every great artist, every poet, when the image of beauty that he appeared to pursue until then as a continual ascent suddenly inverts and starts falling directly downwards, so to speak. It is this topical moment that finds expression in Twombly's untitled piece, in the cracking of the wood that, reversing its upward movement, falls back to earth at the point where the scroll inscribes its Rilkean motto." Now, just looking at this slide, we can perhaps see what Agamben means. The sculpture renders the idea of a broken flower, a flower that is falling as much as it is rising, snapped in half. As I mentioned earlier, there is an inscription at the base of it, on which are written some lines from Anna Maria Loca's 10th Duino elegy. Agamben makes much of this proximity between the poem and the sculpture. And in fact, he even reads the sculpture as the formal enactment of the images that Rilke's poem gives of natural life, which is invariably cracked, broken, and in a vertical freefall. If there is a, quote, spiritual hurricane brewing within that might represent the essential will of the artist or the poet, that tempest nonetheless brews within a, quote unquote, self that is nothing but fiber and tissue cracked. The entire movement of the poem seems to be one of the elevation and falling, and is evidenced for Agamben in the lines just following a description of the ascent of a dead youth up a mountain of suffering, where Rilke writes, "But if the endlessly dead awakened a symbol in us, perhaps they would point to the catkins hanging from the bare branches of the hazel trees, or would evoke the raindrops that fall onto the dark earth in springtime." Directly after these lines in the poem is where we find the quote-unquote Rilkean motto of which Agamben speaks, which is inscribed at the base of Twombly's sculpture. The implication in Agamben's reading is that the poet who has placed the idea of falling in the vertical image of hanging flowers and falling raindrops, images of a nature that is descending towards the earth, has regarded his poetic activity as being oriented towards the earth as well. This orientation, however, is not to be understood as mere fallenness. A genre of writing that lacked all sense of itself as art would not have served Agamben's argument, I think. Rather, Agamben reads Rilke as demanding that the very form of the poem be understood as the falling movement of natural life. The poem completes itself symbolically and metrically on the suspension of the poet's will. An interruption in the line beginning branches of the hazel trees, comma, or, and then continuing after the fracture in the line with would evoke the raindrops that fall onto the dark earth in springtime, renders the, quote, inactive core of every work visible, if not audible, fracturing the idea of the work as a product of the artistic will even further. At the, quote, core of every work is a point of inactivity, at which the will of art supporting it seems almost blinded and suspended. Agamben finds an analogy to this movement in Twombly's sculpture, inasmuch as it, quote, falls back to earth at the point where the squirrel inscribes its Rilkean motto, namely the following concluding lines of the elegy. "And we, who have always thought of happiness as rising, would feel the emotion that almost overwhelms us whenever a happy thing falls." The work of art gives a formal presence to an interruption that correlates to the movement of falling, to the point at which the will of art supporting the work of art, and holding it still, as it were, almost appears to be suspended. The work of art is, quote unquote, as it were, born upon the death of authority, and is in that way analogous to the point where natural life and the will to art, or action and non-action, become indistinguishable. Now, why did I say that this idea, or topical moment, has anything to do with the condition under which our natural lives are rendered governable and productive for ends possibly other than our own? Well, because there exists an analogous point at which action and non-action become indistinguishable in the history of political thought pertaining to the smooth functioning of the modern liberal democracy. This is namely the point once again that for Agamben is this very sculpture. This is namely the moment at which law and life become indistinguishable from one another, such that the lives we lead as natural bodily creatures are entirely governable in accordance to the ends of governance. It is a moment in the development of what is known as biopolitics, which Agamben himself has called the zone of indistinction in his political theoretical writings. Now, what I'm going to do now is to briefly recapitulate the argument surrounding the political counterpart to the topical moment that Agamben sees in this Twombly sculpture, in order to demonstrate to what extent and with what consequence this political counterpart to the sculpture, namely the zone of indistinction, is inscribed into the history of the aesthetic writ large. There is, according to Agamben and others, an unspoken genealogy that traces modern democracies back to the administration of natural life in the ancient polis, as well as the governance of divine life by church ceremony and monastic order. The condition that makes it possible for natural life to be amenable to administration at all is the very point at which the law and life become indistinguishable from one another. This is what Agamben refers to as the zone of indistinction. This point of indistinguishability, however, is a moment characteristic of a state of political crisis. And the point of indistinguishability becomes recognizable as such, as this point of indistinguishability, only to the extent that the very operative core that allows the law to be applicable to life is revealed to be the product of a political fiction. Now, to backtrack a little bit, according to the French legal historian Theodore Reina, Napoleon's decree of December 24th, 1811, gave the emperor the right to put a city under siege and under the power of the military police, regardless of whether or not the city was actually under attack by enemy forces, if ever there was a need to increase the power of the police. This, so Reina points out, was to be understood as a political because fictitious state of siege. Remember, the state of siege is a military term. A military state of siege is literally the word to describe the fact that a city is being besieged by an army from the outside. That is literally the state of siege. Here we're talking about a metaphorical or fictitious and therefore political state of siege. And the word state of siege, état de siège, was actually used, which is pointing. So Reina points out, so this fictitious state of siege, and therefore political state of siege, was to be understood as opposed to a real state of siege where enemy forces in fact presented a clear and present danger. In turn, the idea that a political state of siege might be understood as an institution or fiction harks back to the revolutionary French Constituent Assembly's decree on July 8, 1791, that a city may be put in an état de siège, or a state of siege, by legal mechanism alone. A century later, the French revolutionary notion of the political or fictional state of siege then becomes the paradigm for governance under a liberal democracy for the early 20th century jurist and political theorist Carl Schmitt, who gives it the name state of exception. In Schmitt's interpretation, the political fictional state of siege, qua state of exception, is the legal mechanism by which the continued functioning of government may be assured by the governing power itself, as opposed to divine right of sovereign, for example. Its mechanism, however, operates as legal mechanism per se, that is to say, by revolutionary decree. That is, after the decapitation of the King of France, the governing power has to be able to grant itself the right to perpetuate in the administration of life. To use Agamben's words, Schmitt's state of exception separates the norm from its application in order to make the application of the law possible. It introduces a zone of anomy into the law in order to make the effective regulation of the real possible. The state of exception marks a threshold at which logic and praxis, or one can understand it as form and norm, blur with each other, and a pure violence without logos claims to realize an enunciation without any real reference, and as such operates as the condition of possibility for governance. By the same token, however, the condition of possibility for governance in the modern liberal democracy hinges upon a pure violence without any real reference, a fiction, as which alone the exercise of the political after sovereignty has henceforth to be understood. In other words, the condition of possibility for governance on the principle of autonomy is an image of the inseparability of natural life and political power, which was originally posited as a political fiction aimed at increasing the military powers of the police. The efficacy of such a fiction is as indisputable as it is evident in the rendering of lives in whatever natural forms they may find themselves, young, black, disenfranchised, impoverished, banned from all manner of self-sustenance, imminently policeable. In any event, what seems clear is that the very idea of a zone of indistinction, inasmuch as the indistinction blurs the distinction between life and the law, and indeed runs through any action that might be deemed as autonomous and self-legislating, has its roots in an emergency declaration of the suspension of any self-legislation whatsoever on the part of those lives impelled to discipline themselves. Inasmuch as this emergency declaration of the suspension of the self-legislative will is put forth as a fiction, and only therefore as political, the indistinction between natural life and political power therefore runs deep into the history of aesthetics. Indeed, both critics and defenders of Agamben have tended to center on a so-called aestheticization of politics. Some have argued that it leaves no room for a viable concept of the political, while others have suggested that Agamben means to imply that what is at stake is how we arrive at deciding on what is political and what is not. That decision between the political and the non-political, read non-policed excess of natural life, may in turn be thinkable but not actual, seen as understanding how we come to regard things, ideas, and practices as entering the political realm implies that the entire realm of human action is in fact de facto political. In other words, insofar as we consider ourselves as capable of self-governance, there is no human action that would not be political, since the concept of power covers the whole domain of action, from which we do not simply enter and exit at discrete points in time. Is Agamben interested primarily in rewriting the history of political thought as the history of its mode of appearances? Or does he recover, or intend to recover, a modicum of that non-policed excess of natural life in the aesthetic, however this might be now defined? Now let me at this juncture provide a couple of counterpositions on the so-called aestheticization of politics to truly throw into relief what is at stake. According to one line of argument, and this is one represented by a philosopher called Juliana Leibentisch, not sure if it's been translated. Nonetheless, she argues the aestheticization, the term aestheticization, is a term taken to denote an individualistic aesthetics of existence that replaces ethics, or quote-unquote a spectacular staging that replaces politics. The aesthetics implied in this definition of the aestheticization of politics takes a multitude of forms, but represents in total a decision made internally to ethics and politics on what is non-aesthetic, that is, ethics and politics, as opposed to what is not non-aesthetic. For this reason, the aesthetic appears in whatever form it may take, in the context of this decision, not as simply something to be excluded from the ethical political realm. Rather, the aesthetic is implicated precisely in how we imagine ethics and politics to be. The debate on aestheticization is therefore systematic and belongs in the domain of the history of philosophy. Aestheticization is therefore the history of the diagnoses of crisis, that are articulated in resistance against displacing ethics and politics by aesthetics. The diagnosis that there has been an aestheticization process implies the claim that there is a proper and undisplaced essence to ethics and politics, however. This holds true for a number of arguments made about aestheticization, which come from a variety of positions. For instance, both the argument that content has been emptied into images, or action into performances, and self-understanding into postures, as well as the opposing argument that the relation between self and world is constructive and expresses itself in free formation in the domain of life, presuppose that the life world has been aestheticized to such an extent that matters of taste, enjoyment, and so forth have taken over all areas of life to the detriment of any other criteria. Associated with this line of argument is that aesthetic motifs such as creativity, spontaneity, and originality no longer belong to the domain of freedom proper, but have been co-opted into being modes of productivity in the capitalist economic system. However, does this argument imply that political autonomy is aesthetic, and conversely, that the aesthetic is tantamount to a form of autonomy? And if so, my thesis that aestheticization is a decision essential to the constitution of ethical political discourse restrict the discussion necessarily to the question of sovereignty. Now, according to another line of argument that might be counterposed to this one's represented by Eva Goylin, the very declaration that art has come to an end has a discourse of its own, and may very well be a compulsion in itself. Now, according to this argument, the aestheticization process that some see as intrinsic to the way in which we imagine ethics and politics, both historically and today, is part of this discourse of proclaiming that art has come to an end to the extent that it is perceived to have lost its autonomy and being co-opted into the capitalist economy, for instance. Now, what seems clear is that in contrast to both of these positions, the question that Agamben poses to the artwork is not a decision between the political fictional versus the non-political, non-fictional work of art, whatever the latter may actually be in any case. The inactivity at the core of the artwork for Agamben does not denote a failure or suspension of the cognitive realm alone, which is to say that the work that is done by the artwork is the work of the art. So the artwork is the work that is done by the artwork, and as such, the significance of the point of indistinguishability between action and non-action in the aesthetic cannot be considered merely as epistemological, but rather essentially fundamentally ontological. Now, arguably, this is already in the concept of beautiful since Kantian aesthetics, which Kant articulated as a force for the edification of a community of taste. And now, so in order to sort of explicate what Agamben means by an ontological rather than epistemological understanding of the work of art, I'm going to give a very abbreviated summary of Kant's position. So just bear with me. I'm going to try to go through this in case this will clarify what's going to come. So, as I'm sure you know, the question that Kant sought to answer in his understanding of aesthetics was the question of the prominence of taste. Now, what is taste exactly, and why taste? Taste is the sensible counterpart, or the sensory counterpart to something like opinion. So if you have opinion in the realm of politics, the aesthetic counterpart, or the counterpart in terms of the realm of our sensory experience and our experience as beings living in the world would be this notion of taste. Taste was one of the major discoveries of the 18th century, and aesthetics was invented as a field to deal with this new invention of the concept of taste. Now, why was it important? Well, first of all, you cannot force somebody to take pleasure in something or someone. But you can educate somebody to elevate taste through, for instance, formation of education. But you cannot decide to like something. You either like it or you don't. And it brings you to the brink of a moment of crisis, so to speak. We decide how we feel about something. Not that we feel something, but we decide how we feel about it. And these are aesthetic decisions. Moreover, the idea of community then developed out of like-minded people exercising their ability to find one another. So this is just in the context of the 18th century also. Now, these communities developed in specific contexts, scientific and artistic contexts, by their ability to find each other and persuade rather than to demonstrate to one another. The right is reserved to leave this community whenever you want. However, this right is articulated with an ideal voice, and the persuasion refers to an object that everybody likes. And so out of this situation, out of this context within Kant's writing, an idea of a universal community was engendered, in which all opinions, i.e. something like the political public counterpart to taste, all opinions are projected to be equal, so that certain acts of good are preferred over those whose objects are too close to the senses of taste and to touch. This universal community is also utopian. It's not constituted by force or by scientific demonstration, but rather based on something like the equivalent of absolute peace. Now, everybody in this universal community also never has the right to his or her opinions, which is once again a sentence uttered in an ideal projected voice. And it was in the Critique of the Power of Judgment, which was published in 1790, that then Kant sort of takes this notion of taste and elevates it in order to build as a bridge between the world of natural laws and the world of moral laws in two ways. The bridge was proposed to be to attain to two particular forms. First was the beautiful, and the second was the Republican Constitution. So sort of the beginnings, the idea of governance that arose in the wake of the French Revolution, in other words. Both of these have a fundamental connection to one another, namely that both of them are in fact a substitute for the moral world. Once again, remember this is a universal community whose universality is like it dictates spoken in an ideal voice about the shared taste for an object. Both of these are substitutes for the moral world. Beauty, insofar as beauty is a sensible symbol, beauty is taken to be a sensible symbol of morality, and the perfect constitution, the Republican Constitution, is considered to be the matrix or the womb of moral progress, i.e. legal progress in Kant's definition. And so he comes to this thesis that nature is amenable to freedom, and nature, that is the realm within we lead also our natural lives, our bodily lives. Nature is amenable to freedom, and its amenability is expressed in beauty, and shows that the distinction between cognition and agency is not in opposition. Now there is furthermore an immediate relation between judgment and feeling, which he called aesthetic judgment, and by which our judgment is immediately connected to the faculty of moral feeling when we judge something as beautiful or sublime. Now, once again, very briefly, what is important to understand about aesthetic judgment is this. When we say that an object is beautiful, we are not talking about a determination of the object. We're not actually judging an object that has beauty as one of its predicates. In fact, we bracket out both the ethical and the cognitive. That is to say, we bracket out both the question of what a flower is good for, and also that the flower is considered as an object as such. Since we are now talking about nothing but how we feel about it. The moment of aesthetic judgment in which this is expressed is therefore the one moment in which action and cognition are equally bracketed out. And this moment is what is aesthetic. That bracketing out of action and cognition is what makes that moment aesthetic. What is the condition for bracketing out of action and cognition? It is the bracketing off of the idea that there is any world out there whatsoever. In aesthetic judgment, we are concerned solely with representation. That is to say, not representation in terms of the mimetic sort of veracity of the representation to its object, but rather the representation or images that we give ourselves of the external world insofar as our sensory apparatus receives it. Now, this provides the context for a different kind of freedom from that posited by the moral law of a self-legislating autonomous agent. Indeed, aesthetic freedom can be understood as freedom from moral freedom, in which one can solely reflect on how you feel about an object. The delight in experiencing this judgment kicks in, moreover, at the moment when the higher self that imposes moral judgment is suspended. Now, to really abbreviate, and I'm going to get through this Kant section very soon, the space for freedom is therefore aesthetics. In sum, where the moral law speaks, there is no freedom of choice, paradoxically, or unexpectedly. Freedom may be the basis for morality, but we are not able to exempt ourselves from the moral law. Aesthetic experience, by contrast, is a free space in which moral and physical laws are equally suspended with no consequences. Thus, if one wants to undertake an emancipatory project, it is essential, according to Kant, that this be pursued in relation to aesthetic objects. And therefore, Kant thinks that aesthetics is what makes humanity. In an essay written shortly after the critical three critiques, critique of pure reason, critique of practical reason, critique of the power of judgment, Kant discovers that we can claim that we have gotten more moral in the progress of our human history, but that is an inner lie or acting on bad faith. For the inscrutability of the moral law is absolute for Kant, and to ascertain that it is more moral is to make it be less moral. Now, to sort of illustrate what that point is supposed to say, there's a reading of that Heidegger does of Kant in which he makes a very similar observation. In Heidegger's reading of Kant, he asks, why are humans fallen? When he says, humans are fallen not from grace to evil, but only to the extent that we ascertain where we are, that is, whatever position, good, bad, etc. Hanging on to an identity is tantamount to fallenness. So the very like identification of our position, moral position, or relative position in morality is tantamount to being fallen. And we hang on to it, however, because we are fallen. And the only way out is to let go, which is to say, not mistake progress for moral progress. And so the phenomenal world has to become more moral, but we can never come to the point where we can make the cognitive claim that it is more moral. So in that case, what is it about the world that gives rise to this rather useless feeling of the beautiful? When we encounter natural beauty, so Kant, it affords us a free favor that frees us from moral and cognitive obligations. The world indicates that it is moral too, insofar as it is amenable to morality, to something other than itself. That is to say, it is not impossible that the phenomenal world, that is to say the world regulated by natural laws, could be moral. Because if it were impossible, then human life would be in despair. Cognition and morality would, in that case, never be bridged. And this is all evident, according to Kant, because there is an added dimension to the phenomenal world that is experienced by us in the form of beauty. And moreover, this experience, our capacity to experience beauty as this addition to the phenomenal world, this incorrigible phenomenal world, shows that we are also amenable to morality. The greater the capacity for beauty, the more human. And human here refers to all things even beyond space and time. That is to say, this world consists not in feelings, but in the constitutive communicability of feelings. And because And this is because beauty is exactly like a cognitive judgment and is exactly the same as everybody else's without yet being cognitive. As mentioned before, there is a postulate of a universal voice when you make an aesthetic judgment. The structure of it is such that you speak for all of humanity. And you can change your mind, which just means that you also change the mind of all of humanity. And that, in essence, is Kant's definition of liberation. Now, to return to Agamben, what is it that Agamben makes of this, that makes it possible to understand what his intervention into post-Kantian aesthetics as an ontological one as opposed to epistemological? Well, for him, for Agamben, the work of art since Kant came to be regarded as precisely this object of disinterested judgment, that is to say, the judgment that is divorced from sort of any determination of the object. Rather, it's a cipher for freedom insofar as it is merely in the realm of our feelings, how we feel about this object, independent of the actual corrigibility of the natural world, the phenomenal world. So the work of art in the Kantian framework came to be regarded as an object of disinterested judgment and aesthetic enjoyment alone, then, right, community of taste, such that it became dissociated from political efficacy. So once again, for Kant, that's the very point, and that's the only way in which the judgment of beauty can be a way to bridge, can be a way to bridge reason and morality by freedom. For Agamben, art in modernity, i.e. art after Kant, has lost its significance since that it once enjoyed in antiquity. He points out that art once inspired divine terror and power over the soul, and in such a way that Plato felt impelled to banish poets from the polis, and Sophocles' Antigone to call man's capacity to bring things into being, or his techne, the most uncanny thing that there is. Now, in an age when art has become a matter for the spectator's contemplation and enjoyment, as an object for determining how we feel about it, a matter of taste, art is divested of its purpose in the name of universality and impersonality, in the name of this ideal voice. Yeah? Only when art is merely interesting does it lend itself to acceptance in this age. And any trace of the political in art lingers only in the sense of mortal risk that modern artists convey, and typically in autobiographical or other self-reflexive writings, as though the activity of bringing something new into the world might be understood only either as madness or some other form of authorial death, or that which poses an imminent danger to society. The result of the introduction of Kantian aesthetic judgment, according to Agamben, is therefore certain poverty in art. To the extent that the aesthetic judgment divorces art from the principle of creation and places its value solely in taste, aesthetics after Kant turns on a principle of what Agamben calls non-art. Art that is without interest, on which the spectator depends for its essence, but which essentially does not belong to the spectator, insofar as the spectator is not the creator. Aesthetics thus confronts us with an aesthetic subjectivity that is evacuated of content and personality. A tool indispensable for knowing the work of art, the aesthetic judgment paradoxically prevents us from penetrating its reality and instead points towards something other than art and presents art's reality as a pure nothingness. Aesthetic judgment introduces a split between the work of art as a product, as the living and unmediated reality of the artist's will, and as reception by disinterested spectator, before whom the masterpiece might as well dissolve into an assemblage of meaningless shapes, and for whom the value of any work of art is indifferent to any distinction between good and bad. Now, for Agamben, so deeply entrenched is this antagonism between art and non-art in our thinking at large that even our standard for judging nature is determined by its aesthetic value. Our relation to the world in which we know and act is understood as an actualization of the will, for which aesthetics holds up the artwork as the model, and to which it has given a variety of names in the history of Western philosophy: reason, freedom, universal being, even human condition. And at the same time, since the artwork has been reduced to an object at the disposal of aesthetic consumption, the expression of will exemplified by the artwork acquires the efficacy of technical reproduction. Without a unitary understanding of how human action might attain to concretion without being predetermined by some use or purpose, our productive relation to the world can only be one of commodification and instrumentalization. At the center, then, is a decisive moment of modernity, and also of modernity's self-definition, in which art was distinguished from non-art. And implied is that the rhetoric of an aestheticization of politics results from this division. Moreover, this division occurs not only internally to modernity's self-description, but also internally to aesthetics itself, as opposed to political discourse. For this reason, Agamben sees the need for a destruction of aesthetics in terms of the history of aesthetic discourse since Kant, a clearing away, and in this he follows Heideggerian terminology, of received notions about art qua human productive activity that had been taken for granted and had obscured art's original unitary character. And in the first instance, it is in the concept of poiesis, Plato's term for bringing something into existence that did not previously exist, that Agamben finds expression of the original unity of thinking and acting as instantiated in quote-unquote art. By restoring art's this world-disclosing and praxis-enabling structure, what Agamben wants to do is uncover the ground for a genuinely new and non-instrumentalized and non-commodified emergence of things. As poiesis, the structure designated as artwork is logically prior to all productive and life-sustaining activity, with which art had hitherto been related only either as the abnegation of material conditions or as a slave to the ends of bare biological existence. And the destruction of aesthetics, therefore, also distinguishes what is genuinely human from the merely living being, the animal, that works and in work produces himself and subjugates the work. Now, to conclude, I'm going to come back briefly to the piece Agamben wrote inside Twombly. It's interesting, I think, to note that as I was mentioning earlier in the outset, there is a suspension at the core, this inactive center at the core of the artwork that Agamben is interested in recovering as sort of the way in which to understand the artwork, not as in an epistemological sense, not as a function of aesthetic judgment, but rather as ontology, and as ontology as the unitary ground that is uncovered after the destruction of this discourse about aesthetics that pertains to the art object as some sort of product of human activity, right? And it's really worth pointing out at this juncture then that Agamben is also somewhat ambivalent about his model for the suspension of the identification of the artwork with the actualization of the will, that is the product of human activity. On the one hand, he follows Nietzsche, who locates man's essence and his will to the eternal return of his actions, in finding in nihilism a positive potential to recover art's capacity to redeem in nature's accidents, a modicum of ground for a world and a relation to truth. On the other hand, Agamben also disavows Nietzsche, claiming to follow then Benjamin in describing the eternal recurrence of the same as no better than rote memorization, assigned as a schoolboy's punishment. Agamben places Nietzsche really at the apex of the trajectory taken by art as praxis through the history of Western thought, whose redemptive character emerges only at the moment when the mechanicity of nihilism, understood as the idea that the total character of the world is that all representations of our knowledge ultimately lose their meaning, and therefore at this point of realization overcomes itself. And it's this suspension, this moment of suspension, that I think he's trying to get at in the Twombly piece. In the in the piece on Twombly, this sort of ambivalent position of this Nietzschean idea is superseded by the caesura. So this is what I was talking about earlier about the break in the line. the caesura is the metrical break, is the metrical break that Agamben sees as the structure par excellence for this originarily non-purposive character of artistic activity, that is this enacted core to the artwork, and therefore as a ground to the relation of truth. It's interesting to note that the piece that Agamben cites to get at the theory of the caesura is written by Hölderlin in the throes of his own insanity. So there you also have Agamben intentionally citing a piece that is written sort of after the suspension of sort of any authorial self-presence. This is a notion of the self-interruptive moment in a work of art, a work of poetry, that is articulated as a sort of rhythm or an ontological principle in interrupting the incessant flows of instance that also comprise its instance, then therefore discloses man's position also in the world as a poetic suspension, as a poetic epoche. Indeed, the Hölderlin epoche, or the suspension, is tasked with supplying the conceptual framework for comprehending the being of the work of art. This sculpture by Twombly is, among others then, one artwork whose ontological principle is described in terms of the self-interruptive temporality described by Hölderlin's notion of a counter-rhythmic suspension, as he says. Which brings me to the point once again about this sort of like ambiguous and also quite difficult notion of understanding what is achieved by what Agamben calls the proximity between the movement in the verse and that of Twombly's sculpture. For Agamben, the Twombly sculpture, insofar as it is the formal instantiation of what he reads from a notion of the self-interruption of a poem written by a poet who's not quite all present in himself, is the capturing of the modern subject's alienation from all content as the authentic content of the artwork. And the point of modern art for Agamben then is to capture this alienation itself as the very content of the artwork. Now, he references other people, most notably this idea of disorientation vis-a-vis the untransmissibility of content as this sort of self-interruptive moment of the artwork itself. He takes reference from, say, Benjamin's Theory of History, in which Benjamin describes this very famous painting by Paul Klee of the Angel of History, who is swept inexorably into the future while his face is turned towards the ruins of the past, for instance. And likewise, elsewhere, so Baudelaire is also credited with liberating things from their usefulness as a sort of like analogous sort of cipher for this authenticity that is housed specifically not in the self-presence of the artwork, but rather in the alienation from the past itself that becomes then the value for the artwork. The experience of shock for Baudelaire, then marks the power acquired by things when they lose their transmissibility and comprehensibility. So once again, in the throes of madness, in the self-suspension of the that is instantiated by the artwork, and that is nothing other than the content of the artwork. That loss of transmissibility and comprehensibility within a given order itself becomes the last source of meaning for the artwork. Now, Agamben then identifies the point of departure for an alternative trajectory to modernity in a number of other things, but specifically, and what I really wanted to end on, is the fact that it is there's a notion of a space that is opened up, a potential space that is an analogy to the zone of indistinction that makes it difficult, that opened up the problem to begin with about the relation between the aestheticization of politics and the sort of history of the modes of appearance of politics. It opens up a third space, And that would be the counterpart to the zone of indistinction that is defined precisely on this brink of like comprehensibility and incomprehensibility that would be nothing other than the content of the artwork itself. This essential space or third area is neither internal nor external for Agamben, and it's neither subjective nor objective, and it's found in such sort of cultural phenomena as child's play, or in specifically, and most interestingly, in the space of this in-between space between what would become the division between the mind and the body. And specifically, this is the space where the inspired poetic sign, and in this case the poetic sign he gets from medieval troubadour poetry, namely very sort of over-the-top love poetry where the object is precisely not there, and insofar as the object is not there, the very idea that there can be a concrete declaration of love in this poetic declaration for a lost object can be considered as concrete. So in these medieval troubadour lyrics, which are like extremely over the top, Agamben finds the most concrete declaration of desire. And it is the space that's opened up by that, by these, that presents a challenge to theories of signification that would be modeled on an understanding of the sign as rather some expressive unity of the signifier and signified. That is, for instance, like the notion that the artwork in itself contains the meaning that would that the artist, the will of the artist would like to express. Such theories are founded on the presumption that their original fracture is a process of moving towards the manifestation of content in the form. Here, on the other hand, as Agamben is trying to point out with the Twombly piece, it is the form that is moving towards its content. The form itself is constituting nothing. Nothing other than form is constituting the content of the art. Now, focusing on this incongruence and displacement between appearance and essence means that these medieval poetics I was talking about, mentioning earlier, the pneumatic medieval poetics, where the signification happens as a process of this fluid motion between the stomach and the mind, the concretion, where the concrete declaration of love is nothing other than in the poetic declaration of love. The poetic declaration of love is the most concrete insofar as the object is lost. Yeah, that is what points for Agamben towards this originary situation of language as a nexus of reciprocal differences that would be irreducible to something like an economics of substitution between appearance and essence, and which functions rather as a whole or some topological game, where signifier and signified are first put together. The unitary linguistic being and waiting that is proposed here, so this game where signifier and signified is first put together, this pre-linguistic stratum, is here an ontological category. It develops from an epistemological idea of culture being a process of transmission and afterlife, in which is revealed the schizophrenia that splits Western culture into something like inspired and ecstatic and rational conscious poles. Language fulfills the task of rendering this visible, and this being the political fictions, therefore, the putting together of signifier and signified before the fact. These are rendering these zones of indistinction visible, rendering these and therefore the political fictions, the constructions of the political fictions visible, into which life and law then enter at times of political crisis. This task is fulfilled by language. And this language fulfills this task by being conceived as a nexus of these reciprocal differences, by which Agamben means that in no way does language exhaust itself in the stable and lexical relations presumed to be expository in the run-up against the limit in poetry. in which it is in fact possible to dissociate meter and syntax, the break, the caesura, right, the Agamben at the end of the line, the metrical break that is dissociated from the syntax, and therefore, in this break, in the process of the suspension, reveal the linguisticity of language, the languageness, the language character of language itself, that resides in an inherent non-coincidence of something like sound and sense. The enjambment, which is the term that he also uses in the Twombly piece, enjambment is simply the metrical term, the poetic term for the metrical suspension of the line. So basically, if you have the rhythm of the line sort of interrupted on one line and it continues on the next verse, that's an enjambment, more or less. The enjambment, Agamben writes in another text, outlines the possibility, therefore, of making sense in language whatsoever, to the extent that signification is brought to presence in extremis in the poem. Once again, in the poem that he finds a model for in these pneumatic sort of medieval troubadour lyrics that are pretty precisely concrete because they are over the top, because they're dedicated to an absent object. This presence of signification in the extremis in the poem was once described by Paul Valéry as a prolonged hesitation between sound and sense. The verse defines itself only at the point where it ends, but before the meaning of a sentence is complete. Again, just the redescription of l'enjambment, in which regard the poem as a whole can be understood as an ostentatious means of maintaining its existence by delaying its collapse into an exact coincidence of sound and meaning. So in this case, you can see the entire being of the poem, which for Agamben is equivalent to the being of this very sculpture, is nothing but the prolongation of its collapse into itself. Since absolute comprehension signals the end not only of poetry, but also of thinking in general, the linguisticity of the language character of language revealed in poetic form conditions the very possibility of philosophy. And once again, when I say poetic form, Agamben in this piece is also saying the work of art in general. This is why Agamben takes someone like Wittgenstein to mean that when he writes that philosophy should really only be poeticized. For thinking to persist as a possibility, then language must be allowed to communicate itself without remaining unsaid in what is said by falling into an endless falling into silence. And I'm going to end there. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Julia. That was a really extraordinary lecture. I'm very glad you mentioned the French Revolution and decapitation.
I put it in because I
Yeah, a little time. But not only because it's applied, but I think it also raises a question which was running through my mind as I was hearing you, which is that the moment of the French Revolution and the decapitation of the king is also the moment of the attempted institution of a new kind of radically egalitarian atheist state. So it's a moment of institution. And it's about the relation between institution and judgment that I want to ask you. You moved into this idea of indistinction through the notion of aesthetic judgment and described the notion of aesthetic judgment as a kind of decision. Now, I mean, in Kant, aesthetic judgment doesn't first of all apply to art objects, it applies to things of nature. I mean, once you bring art in, you also bring in the maker of the work of art. I mean, for Kant, the genius. And so the question, or maybe the first question that arises in my mind is, If the genius is an institutor for Kant, and I think he is, because Kant also introduces the notion of the work of art as original. Therefore, as original, as a kind of institution, I'm interested in what the moment of indistinction in institution would be. I mean, you mentioned towards the end of your talk inspiration. And inspiration is literally a kind of breathing in and a sort of exposure to the outside as well. And is that the kind of equivalent within genius to the moment of indistinction, or the caesura, this turn, as it were, from blowing off to breathing in terms of creation? And then following from that, I would go to the end of your talk and ask then, what is the relationship between the moment of indistinction in institution and the moment of the collapse of the work of art? That is, in a sense, approaching the collapse through the institution, as it were, rather than perhaps through the judgment, or are they essentially in some sense the same for you?
Let me just make sure I don't forget your questions.
I don't know if it makes sense, the question.
It does. I might have to ask you to repeat the second one over. But so in answer to the first one, what is the moment of indistinction in institution? For instance, the institution that would be something like the genius, and therefore when creation re-enters the equation, and then also in relation to the moment of inspiration I was sort of gesturing at towards the end. Well, a couple of things to mention. There's some sort of uneasy relationship, I think, that sits between Agamben and Kant, that I think that I didn't fully address, which is that I think that what Agamben reduces Kant to is precisely this non-institutional version of aesthetic judgment. So, insofar as that's true, yeah, I mean, there's no like answer to like to how something like an Agamben term like indistinction, the identification of something like indistinction, insofar as it grows out of Agamben's sort of disclosure of a certain depoliticization of the artwork, since Kant can be identified in Kant's thought itself. That having been said, what I think the indistinction does in terms of institution generally comes precisely in at this juncture where I was saying that he develops this notion of suspension and as a counterpart of distinction in this in medieval poetics. And basically, I can like maybe elaborate a little bit on what this inspiration is supposed to be doing. It's anything but genius. So once again, like Agamben is interested in doing away with dissociating the artwork from creation, but in such a way that creation can be rethought not in contradistinction to deception, but rather as the very zone by which, you know, something like the artwork can indicate to the human where the place of the human is. So how this is sort of, how this evolves in the way Agamben at least thinks about this is in terms of these medieval troubadour poems, in which specifically he turns to the indistinction, once again, between medieval poetics and psychophysiological treatises, sort of pseudo-scientific treatises in the Middle Ages that say that the spirit is moving in this weird medium throughout the body, like circulating between mind and body, such that there is no distinction between the two. And specifically, and this is the part I kind of skipped on, maybe I should have included it in, but the inspiration is not merely a matter of genius. And specifically, the inspiration in this context of the spirit medium that's supposed to circulate throughout conjoins the seat of desire in the mind, quote unquote, and the seat of desire in the genitals. So basically, medieval poetics for Agamben has a very specific understanding of creation. It's not creation out of this institution of genius. He debunks that by going to its sort of alternate prehistory in basically what amounts to a history of medieval erections as a foundation for a poetic sign. So the circulation that makes signification possible at all is looking at creation in a completely different sort of under a completely different set of terms that would institutionalize it as something like, Indistinction. I don't know, something like the institution of the artist per se.
Well, maybe just to come back on that, Lacan wrote that he believes in creation from nothing, as against the evolutionists, by which I take it he means that the sign requires a kind of radical break with the natural, through the law in some way. Now it seems to me that through the Agamben positions is somehow rather different. Still not entirely sure where the difference lies. I mean, something to do with the relational nature of law, but is not in terms of that notion of an absolute break.
This is the point where I feel very ambivalent about Agamben myself. Obviously, there is this root. Right? I regard it as my task and also interest to sort of uncover the roots of the political zone of indistinction. That is only identifiable, as I said, in a moment, as a part of a moment of political crisis. And so, to have this, to try to recover a more affirmative notion of it in Agamben is, maybe a project that, philological one at best, perhaps, because ultimately, I don't know that Agamben has a. I think that Agamben thinks that there is a potentiality in and of itself in something like an indistinction between the indistinction in the ways in which signification happens, and this indistinction occurs this indistinction occurs in as much as it produces something like the institution of the artwork in the revolutionary context, such that it's something like an institutionalization of the artwork can be thinkable at all, right? I think that Agamben tries to sort of go backwards and sort of provide a alternate trajectory towards this modern institution of the idea that artworks can be institutionalized per se, by going to a pre-modern moment in this indistinction. But to what extent that is really successful is another question.
And would it play itself out in terms of, if you like, actual contemporary artists' strategies in terms of supporting some sort of artistic withdrawal or non-action as resistance? Okay. I mean, rather than perhaps an object like this, a sort of broken mob or catkin, or whatever it is.
I didn't know what this is. I thought this was a mob, but apparently it's a flower. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question. I think that Agamben lends himself to be read in that way. I mean, I did mention before, I think there are very strong urges to sort of understand what he's saying about the governability, the conditions for life to be governable in certain sort of, I don't know, figurations of Homo Sacer, basically. action of non-action could actually look like without,
Without disappearing.
without actually just disappearing like Kafka's Hunger Artist, right? Who kind of just disappears into infinity, or into the infinitude of whatever, without concretizing itself into form is another question. I don't know.
Okay, anyone else?
Mm-hmm. Hello. Thank you very much. That was very exciting. I have this obsession of trying to put philosophical stuff, like what we just heard, into really simple terms, and I'm trying to put it into a question, and then hopefully you can answer with a yes or no.
That'd be great.
Yeah, that would be great. So I'm just wondering, because like one thing that I just caught on in your lecture, and that I found very interesting was this, I think, idea of Kant of relating to the artist as a genius, and then the question if the creation, okay, how can I say that? So basically the question of if the creation is coming from a human, or if the creation is coming from God. So that basic question, if art is related to nature or not. So I'm wondering if that is basically a question, like if the invention of the artist around, like from artisan to artist around whatever 1550, with the invention of art history and Vasari and all that, if that was then basically introducing a question of, like if it was basically questioning the existence or almighty power of God that was not questioned before.
Do you really want a yes or no?
If you can, that would be exciting,
So wait,
because we never had a yes or no, I think.
So the
as an
question
answer.
is, does this problem not already exist in the Renaissance? And that's sort of, right? I mean, does not the idea of the artistic authority arising as it does in the Renaissance, and that moment of the Copernican revolution, so to speak, not already? Is that your question?
I don't know if that's my question.
Okay.
I don't know how to say it better. I just kind of had this, like, while I was listening, and I found it very interesting how you talked about, like, because the idea of the artist as a genius then comes back to the question, where does the artist come from? Like, I mean, I don't know, I can't explain it better, but I found it very interesting.
So basically, where is the artist in all of this, kind of?
No, I'm wondering if, like, I mean, of course you're right that that question is already, like, that's happening in the Renaissance, but I'm just wondering how that was, what was the reaction to that around the time that Kant was discussing it?
Oh. Not being an art historian, okay, just first caveat, not being an art historian, there was definitely a cult of the genius, and in the time that Kant was writing, around Kant, around also the time that people after Kant took up certain ideas that he developed would also sort of take very seriously as their ways to overturn certain ideas that Kant posited about the specifically the dissociation of the artwork from its creator as the basis for something like aesthetic judgment, right? So, so the short answer is like yes. This like there is a very strong sense, in particular, of the intimate relation between the role of the artwork and the edification that the artwork can do for the broader public, if you will. Yeah, that Kant then makes his own version of it, right? So he's not operating in a vacuum in terms of like how he dissociates certain understanding of a judgment on beauty from the created artwork itself, right? So shortly after Kant, we have somebody like Hegel, right, who basically I don't know if you could say like recuperates this relation between this essentially, for Hegel, essential relationship between the work of art as a historical sort of object, if you will, or a product of history, and the unfolding of spirit in history, the unfolding of the human spirit in the process of history, such that the artwork per se, as we can sort of categorize in movements of art, in genres of art, in periods of artistic movements through human history, can be seen as coinciding with the real itself. So shortly after Kant, you have this sort of overturning, if you will, of this notion that Agamben himself in particular, I think. And so, yeah, around the time of Kant, yeah, of course, there's a very sort of lively debate precisely on the relation between, the artwork as something like a work of the imagination, right, and I don't know, something like the projection of the universal goal of human history, however one sort of considers it. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry to take over this, the thought follows from that. Very interesting question, which is, I mean, one of the things about the Kantian notion of genius, which I think is really interesting, is that it's a break with the ideal of perfection, that you already know what the law of the work of art is, and you try to achieve it almost as well as the Greeks if you can. And a shift to the idea that the artist invents the law itself of the work of art. That's what it means to be original. To invent the law of the work of art. And that stays in place, I think, pretty much until Duchamp. I mean, in a sense, Duchamp radicalizes it by saying, okay, we'll change the name of the game. And then, ever since then, artists, especially at Goldsmiths, have tried to do that. But so the question then would be, how does Agamben transform that idea of creation? That's what I meant by the question of institution,
right, yeah.
To the notion of falling, as a sort of, if you like, replacement to that, or a shift away from that idea of the institution of the law, which ultimately goes back to the French Revolution, in fact, I think, in political terms for Kant. So, and how is that linked with the idea of decreation? Perhaps you could sort of explain the notion of decreation as well in response to that last question. Interesting.
Right. So I think it's the very understanding of autonomy as having a work of its own to do, right? That this autonomy of the free, that sort of characterizes characterizes the work of art as the product of the self-legislation of certain rules in art, for example, and therefore becomes a cipher for human freedom, is precisely what Agamben finds at odds with a genuine notion of freedom. And it's because he thinks that rather than linking to a genuine sort of expression of something like a new potentiality or something, like a new way of seeing or thinking that would not already be predicated by the need for self-legislation to sort of basically perpetuate itself on the account that it must give of itself, right? So that's the basic mechanism that would be the political counterparts that he sees. Basically, yeah, this link to something like the self-invention of the rules of art is to institution is precisely, looks precisely like that for Agamben. It's precisely that this notion of autonomy in art has defined its own activity on its own self-legislation that he finds that, to be the problem. Why is this a problem? Because it already therefore includes for him then all possible articulations of what could be actualizable from this potential. Now, there's another question whether we agree with Agamben's understanding of potentiality here, but nonetheless, like the problem that he has and the way that the problem that he has with like a notion of autonomous art, right? Our artwork as the product of autonomous activity, or creativity, is precisely that. Like it already, this very idea contains within itself the notion that it has to sort of render account of itself, and that rendering account has to step outside of itself, and that is that dangerous political counterpart that he sees coming also from Kant's revolution. So, yeah, I mean, it's not by coincidence that he's referring to Napoleon, or he's referring to a French legal historian who takes up Napoleon's sort of reiteration in the French Constituent Assembly's first sort of statement about the necessity for fictional state of sea should be declared in order for the governing power to sort of perpetuate its own authority on that which it governs. Falling, therefore, becomes an inversion of this notion that an artwork must only ever be understood as sort of the actualization of a productive will of some kind of artist or some creativity. Once again, because that very idea of artwork that self-legislates is precisely that which doesn't produce anything, it then gets co-opted or easily co-opted into something like that which has always already been a part of the standing political system. So, yeah.
Any more questions?
I think that I wrote down something that you said, I hope I wrote it right, that for politics to be deemed autonomous and self-legislative, it's based on fictional emergency.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay. So I was wondering if that's the case, then for art to have been deemed autonomous and self-legislative, does it also have a fictional emergency, and what would that be?
Yeah. I think that, so again, like Agamben wants to pick apart the idea that artwork is essentially associated with someone who produces it. Now, what is this idea that somebody produces this artwork? It's that this person who produces this artwork has sovereignty over his or her own sort of decisions about what to make into the artwork, right? This is a, you know, you can say it's in the history of thinking about artistic production, I guess this is like the beginnings of the secularization of the notion of art. You know, this was what the previous question was also harkened back to, I think. But I think what he's saying, he's pointing out with the counterpart that he finds in the political legal realm, which is that, you know, then there's a very similar understanding of indistinction, or there's a very similar understanding of how this idea of autonomy in the production of something like an artwork produces something like a legal constitution that can only perpetuate itself by stepping outside of its own legality. And that is what constitutes this political fiction. I mean, the political fiction has its roots in certain declarations in the context of the French Revolution. So I guess you could say like it was very well intentioned. It was revolutionary insofar as its revolutionary character was this sort of like moment of having to legitimate itself. And legitimate itself not by decreeing one's divine right to decree that, but rather legitimate itself on its own power. Now, what does that mean? That means, in the political context at least, that you had to suspend, in essence, the workings of that legal constitution to sort of make that legal constitution sort of keep running. That's a really sort of very reductive way of putting it. The more concrete terms are that, like in the early 20th century, when this notion gets taken up by Carl Schmitt and given the name state of exception, he's talking about the Weimar Constitution. Basically, he's talking about the legal mechanism that more or less enabled like the Nazi Party to be elected into power. So it was like by a suspension of the regulations that was built into the smooth running and perpetuation of that legal constitution itself, that's, you know, the liberal democratic one, that even allowed for something like the total suspension of the constitution. Now that is, that mechanism is conceived originally as political because it was fictitious. And it was political because it was fictitious in the language of these legal theorists, basically because it was not a real military siege. You just had to invent a real and present danger, right? Basically, in today's terms, I mean, there's lots of people talking about crises and the invention of crises. I mean, it's kind of like inventing a crisis in order to bring in the police. That's exactly what it is, right? Now, so that's what Agamben is trying to make of the notion of the autonomy of art in a very sort of roundabout way. What I was trying to suggest is that the political theoretical concept of the state of exception, or the zone of what Agamben calls the zone of indistinction, where this political fiction becomes very efficacious, has its roots in his sort of very long sort of trajectory to a modernity of thinking about the artwork's efficacy, apart from this notion that the artwork can sort of generate its own legitimacy of its own. I hope that answered your question.
Any minutes?
Any other?
If there are no other questions, we can wind up in a moment. But I'd just like to, in terms of perhaps relating this to contemporary art, mention a work, and this is also, of course, a plug, a work that is currently at Matt's Gallery in the show that I co-curated with Robin Klasnick, and it's a work by an ex-Goldsmiths student, Patrick Goddard. Those of you who've already been to maths will have seen it. It's called Free Radicals, and it's from 1913. And what it consists in is a series of sequences of water chutes or water slides, these enclosed water slides, sometimes transparently enclosed, sometimes not. So sometimes you can see outside, sometimes not. Most of them are taken from the internet, some he actually photographed or filmed rather with video as well, and they're sort of edited together to make a more or less sort of continuous and continuously changing movement. Now that movement is, it struck me suddenly listening to Julia, a falling movement. It's falling because it's a slide, obviously subject to gravity. So you have this falling that you're positioned in, in terms of being in the first person position of the camera. Now the soundtrack consists of two voices, two men's voices, one of which is Patrick's, one of which is a kind of person who interjects a sort of ironic tone. And what the voice says, it begins with these words: free radicals, free enterprise, freedom fries, the land of the free, free for alls, free masons, the free market, free range eggs, to free fall, free base cocaine, free gratis and for nothing, free loader, free loving, freedom of speech, free trade, freed slave, freebie, free play of meaning, free verse, free will. And the other one says, yeah, right, just when it comes to free will, significantly. And then it goes on, and freestyle, freehold, freestanding, freeloader. You've said that, the other voice says, bringing in the economics there. Free agent, free time, free healthcare, free willy, free condoms, born free, free as a bird. And then it sort of shifts. So you have all these sort of phrases for freedom which become, both empty and kind of not empty, with this sort of breaking apart of sound and sense as well, this sort of emptying out through the repetition in conjunction with this falling. And that seems to be quite very interesting in relation to what you were saying. A very different work from Twombly, obviously, but seems to be precisely about some kind of connection between linking up this falling to this emptied notion of freedom and institution in the sort of process of the sort of self-reference of the side that is developing there. I don't know if you feel that has any relation whatsoever to what you say.
Well, I remember the piece. I enjoyed it. I wanted to get a slide to it. I think that, yeah, it does. I think maybe one of the upshots of what Agamben is trying to say about falling is that there is a operativity of the accidental and the contingent, right? That lends itself to disjunction or disjunctive relationship to something like modes of production and productivity that already belong in the language and the logic of capitalist economic ideas of freedom, what freedom means. I mean, if this notion of free activity or free will is from the get-go tied to this notion of autonomy that has everything to do with our self-legislation to be more and more productive towards some sort of ends outside of ourselves, because the only way we can maintain our autonomy is to step outside of ourselves, right? To be really, by the 20th century, we get to the point where this stepping outside of ourselves becomes abnegation of natural life towards the anti-totalitarianism, and towards the late 20th, early 21st centuries, it becomes, this notion that, there must be a way to think outside, or, a new way of thinking outside of our place determined by late capitalism, by the financialization of the productivization of all of our lives, right? And also the imminent rendering policeable of all of our lives, I was also mentioning earlier. you know, without yet also repeating the same logic of having to, you know, step up.
Well, the thing about the Patrick Goddard work is it's entirely sort of both. You're both totally trapped within the spectacle, constrained in the water slide, in the kind of entertainment produced by capital, but it's also, you know, something else is going on. It's sort of falling apart as well, but it's inside, it's not sort of outside the spectacle. Okay. I don't want to have the last word.
Yes.
You want to say something?
Just yes.
What?
Just one quick
Okay, good, thank God.
So,
what I was going to say, so I'm interested in the idea of beauty without epistemology, but I wonder how we're going to recognise it.
Oh.
And do we have to recognise it? Because I just think that it's, I think your argument is incredibly empowering in terms of, you know, a use for the artist to move away from validating their work as having some sort of social good or value.
Yeah.
Also, yeah, but how do we talk about the is it just enough to have a position? Maybe that's unanswerable. Maybe it should be unanswerable, but
That's a really great question. There's a certain my inclination is always to think whatever art it is, literary or visual, in terms of the non-programmatic. So I think that maybe in a certain sense the recognition of a certain other configurability of what it means to be productive is already quite an accomplishment. And insofar as this kind of critique of something like the origins of the work of art, right, large, right, accomplishes that, right? I think that's a pretty huge step to have taken, I think. So yeah.
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, thanks for